avoiding Bitcoin to be unspendable.
Any UTXO that's smaller than, a couple 100,000 sats will just become unspendable. The more valuable Bitcoin gets, the more users it attracts, the higher net worth users it attracts, the higher fees they're willing to pay, the more hash rate comes online to secure the network, the more valuable Bitcoin becomes. And it just goes over and over and over like these cycles until it literally sucks in everybody. At a certain point, you reach a full saturation, and that might be around like 10 million users. And that current user, who's like at the kind of the lower end of the wealth spectrum, they get pressed up and they no longer can use the base layer.
Not enough Bitcoiners know what UTXOs are actually and how to properly manage them, what are the risks involved with that, and why should we care about UTXOs. So let's start with like a combination of question, like what are those and why should we care about them?
Sure. Yeah. So UTXOs, they stand for unspent transaction outputs. Okay. And the way that Bitcoin works is it's an accounting system that basically uses these UTXOs, and UTXOs are like chunks of Bitcoin. That's kind of how I always explain them. I think it's easiest to think of them just as, as their own chunks. So similar to how gold comes in chunks, right? It might come in a big bar or a small chunk or a little tiny flake. And those, those chunks are measured in terms of, grams of gold or atoms of gold you can think of. Well, Bitcoin comes in these UTXOs, which are just chunks of Satoshis, right? And so every UTXO has a value that has a Satoshi amount. And whenever you're spending Bitcoin, whether you know it or not, you're really spending these UTXOs. Okay. When you're transacting with Bitcoin, you have to spend the UTXO entirely. So, even if you're, let's say you're sending 1 million sats to somebody else, right? And the only sized UTXOs you have are a bunch of 100,000 Satoshi UTXOs, then you'll have to spend, 10 of them together in order to get that million amount, right? Likewise, if all you have is 10 million sat UTXOs, then you would have to spend a 10 million sat UTXO in its entirety to, basically split it into like a little million sat one, which you'd send to the person, and then you would get a 9 million sat UTXO back to yourself. So the system works in a way where you're always, you're spending these UTXOs in their entirety whenever you transact, and then you're always creating brand new ones on the output side of things, right? That's kind of the overview of what UTXOs are, how Bitcoin as a system works in terms of UTXOs. And, I guess, we can kind of dig into why it's important to manage them now, if you want.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two main aspects to it, like why we should manage them. Like there's one, avoiding Bitcoin to be unspendable, and the second is like privacy. Let's start with the Bitcoin unspendable part of it, because I think this is the part that scares Bitcoiner the more.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so yeah. So in Bitcoin, there's this term called dust, right? Sometimes we call like these really small UTXOs dust. We call them that because they're so small that they can't even be spent without spending a fee that's worth more than the UTXO itself. Okay, so let me give you some context here in terms of how this actually works. Another thing that you have to understand when you're spending Bitcoin is what you're paying for in terms of your transaction fees is you're paying for the amount of data that you need to put into a Bitcoin block, right? And so the more data you need, the higher the transaction fee is going to be. Now, luckily for Bitcoin, the amount of data that's required for spending a UTXO is, for all intents and purposes, the same across all values of UTXOs. So for me to spend a 1 million sat UTXO costs the same amount as for, some whale to spend 1,000 Bitcoin UTXO, right? So this is where the analogy with gold kind of breaks down, right? With gold, a larger amount of gold costs way more to spend, right? Way more to ship overseas or to guard or, that type of thing, right? With Bitcoin, it costs the same amount for a large amount and for a small amount, right? As long as you're kind of dealing with the same amount of UTXOs. So that's kind of the context here, is that like when you're transacting with Bitcoin, you're paying for the data, and the amount of data that's required to spend a UTXO is consistent across all sizes of UTXOs. Okay. So currently, here, let's take a look at the mempool. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you see?
I see it perfectly. Thank you.
All right. So this is a great website. I think most Bitcoiners are familiar with it, but if you're not, I would definitely consider going to this website and kind of clicking through it and seeing what the different things are in here. There's a lot of information, but what this website is, mempool.space, and its primary function is to show you the Bitcoin blockchain. Okay. So over here, you have all the blocks that have already been confirmed. And if you click on any of these blocks, you can see, some of the information of the block, the transactions that got included inside of it and whatnot, right? What I like using this website for primarily is to see the fee rates that people are paying, right? To get into the next block. So you can see here the range in fees, right? Between 16 Satoshis per VByte and 355 Satoshis per VByte. That's the range of fees that people are paying to get into the next block. And then, the ones after that are all in kind of that 15 Satoshi per VByte band. So this is basically the fee rate that you multiply by the amount of data that your transaction requires. Okay. So, right now, I believe a typical transaction takes up about 150 virtual bytes. Okay, so if you were to multiply this lower bound, the 16, right, times 150, what would that give you? 800? Is that what it is? No, probably more than that. I'm getting this off here. One second. Let me just do this before I make a fool of myself. 2,400. So 2,400 Satoshis is how much it would cost in fees to just make a single transaction. Okay. So that's kind of like the minimum amount of Satoshi you would need in a UTXO currently in order to just spend it, right? If you had anything less than that, then that would be dust. So it doesn't sound like that's, too bad of an issue, right? It's like, oh, that's not bad. 2,400 sats, most of your UTXOs are far larger than that, most likely, hopefully. But what happens in the future when this becomes a problem is when the fee rates get higher and they stay higher, right? And the reason why this would happen is you could have, another wave of adoption. Maybe you have more institutions, more high net worth individuals, more aggregate use on second layers, which are settling in these larger batches. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could kind of drive the fees up. And I'm imagining that in the future, there's going to be lots of these kind of aggregate sources of demand, which are happening off chain, and in aggregate on chain, they're going to be paying exorbitant fees, right? Really, really high fees. You'll be competing with, those second layers. You'll be competing with these like ultra high net worth individuals. You'll be competing with, these large institutions, with nation states. And so if Bitcoin succeeds in the ways that we believe it will, right? If it becomes the base layer monetary protocol for the whole world, it's going to have really high fees. And so, these fees we see now, 16 sats per VByte, for example, like these are fees which are happening because we're just really early. And you know, relatively, there's very few people using Bitcoin right now, right? It's probably like 0.01% of the population is actually using Bitcoin like on chain, right? A decent amount of people might have exposure to Bitcoin, but they aren't actually using Bitcoin. They're not submitting transactions on chain, taking it into self-custody, you know, using it to as their money, right? They're just have indirect exposure. So that's kind of, I mean, like that's the fear, is that these fees are going to get really, really high. And I think what we've seen happen in these past fee spikes. So if you go to this tab here, this shows you the fees, and this is just over the last 2 hours. So if we expand this out to say a year, so here you can see kind of like how high the fees have spiked over the past year, right? And actually, I think this one's showing. Oh, this isn't showing a whole year for some reason. Let's just do 6 months then. Yeah, so this spike right here was like the halving spike, right? When fees got really, really ridiculous, and they got up into like the hundreds, if not thousands, of sats per VByte just momentarily. We've seen that happen a couple of times though, right? Like these spikes where we get up into the hundreds or thousands, and those tend to happen during kind of these degenerate, like, you know, shitcoin minting things that are happening right now. But the point is, like, it doesn't take much to push Bitcoin over the edge in terms of the fee rates. All it takes is a handful of degenerates. And if that's all it takes, then imagine what it will take to push Bitcoin permanently into these ranges when you've got, again, like thousands of high net worth individuals, thousands of institutions, hundreds of nation states, and potentially like dozens, if not hundreds of second layers that are trying to compete for, payments layers or, different, privacy layers or like different things, right? There's going to be a lot of things built on top of Bitcoin, and they're all going to be competing for the base layer block space. Okay. So going back to this, we said 16 sat per VByte, it makes a 2,400 sat UTXO dust thereabouts, right? If we were to 100x this, if the fee rates were, say, 1,600 sats per VByte, which I don't think is unreasonable, that would make a 240,000 sat UTXO dust. Did I get that math right? Yeah, I think I did. So that's the concern, right? Is like in the very, very high fee rate environments, you're going to have, really, really large amounts of Bitcoin become dust because any UTXO that's smaller than, like a couple 100,000 sats will just become unspendable. Otherwise, you'll spend more in fees to actually move it, which doesn't make any sense. So you would rather just not move it at all, right? If it's going to cost you more to move it than it's worth, then it becomes worthless, for all intents and purposes. And this kind of also segues into like the whole idea of like, okay, so what is the minimum UTXO size that we might need, right? It's highly dependent on what you think the fee raise could get up to in the future, and nobody knows the answer to that. Like nobody knows exactly how much people are going to be willing to pay in terms of Bitcoin. By the way, a block just got confirmed there, which is kind of fun to watch. But anyways, nobody knows how high the fees are going to get in the future. So nobody really knows what the best UTXO size is. But in that example that I just walked through where fees get 100 times more expensive, right? Which I think, again, is like, it's not unreasonable, but it would be very expensive. Like, I think people would think like, oh, wow, Bitcoin's super expensive to use if the fee rates were in the thousands of sats per VByte, right? That'd be kind of crazy. And even in that case, you're talking about UTXOs worth a couple 100,000 sats becoming dust. If you have a UTXO that's worth 1 million sats, you'll be able to move it, but you'll pay like a 10 to 20% fee to move it. So it's not optimal, but at least you're not getting completely wiped out from the fees. That's why I always kind of say like the starting level kind of the minimum threshold that you want to probably make most of your UTXOs is about 1 million sats. That's like the minimum I would have. And then I think, you also want to kind of have larger ones as well, right? You might start by having 1 million sat threshold, and then after you stack a few million sat UTXOs, and if the fees are like low, like they are now, you might want to consider like, okay, and maybe I'll consolidate a few of these smaller 1 million sat UTXOs into like a larger 5 million or 10 million sat UTXO, just to give you a little bit more protection in the future if fees do get really high,
And consolidation just means that you take different UTXOs in one transaction and therefore have a high UTXO.
Yes. Yep. So going back to kind of how it works, like, when you're paying somebody, if you need to pay them a higher amount than your smallest UTXOs are worth, then you have to use multiple UTXOs to pay them, right? You're literally like, it's kind of like melting down all your pieces of gold into one piece to pay somebody with, right? Similarly, the same thing happens with UTXOs. You use a bunch of them to pay a larger amount, but you can also do that to yourself. So like you can pay yourself, by combining all of your smaller UTXOs to make a bigger one. And that's what we call UTXO consolidation. It's also similar to like, it's like being your own bank, right? It's like being your own bank teller where you can give yourself a bunch of $1 bills and then get yourself back out like $100 bill, right? So, Bitcoin allows you to do those things.
And is there any change when someone has a multi-sig or something like that? Is there a change to that UTXO threshold? Is there like, do you need more?
Yes. Glad you asked. So this is the second slide I was going to share. So I have this reference table. It's a consolidation transaction, UTXO consolidation transaction fee reference table. I put this out on Twitter, and I'll send you the link to this if you want to include it. But basically, we look through this table. I have this is the amount of data that's required for typical single sig transactions, and so we have like a legacy transaction, which is the typically if you see an address that starts with a 1, it's typically a legacy address, right? Native SegWit is the one that pretty much everyone uses nowadays. Like most people use native SegWit, so that's kind of the standard type of transaction. And then the more recent type, the Taproot transaction, is what the most recent soft fork enabled. But these are all the different amounts of data that's required for each of these transactions. So there's a little bit of overhead in each of them, meaning just like some, standard data that's required for the transaction. And then here is the amount of data required for every input that you add to the transaction and the amount of data required for every output that you add to each transaction. Okay. So when we were just talking about like spending Bitcoin, right? If you're spending Bitcoin and you have to spend with a lot of UTXOs, for every single UTXO that you add, you have to add this much data, right? Because this is the amount of data that's required for adding the UTXO and the signature to spend it, right? And then likewise for every output that you're creating, this is the amount of data that's required. So when Cash App processes a batched transaction where they're paying out, hundreds of plebs with their withdrawals, for every single output that they're creating, for every withdrawal that they're creating in that batch transaction, they have to include this much data to pay that person out, right, to process that withdrawal. So this is basically just the table for like how much data is required. And then here are some just quick examples of like the overall data that would be required for a 2 input, 1 output transaction, 5 input, 1 output, 10 input, 1 output, 20 input, 1 output. And these would be like, kind of the typical amounts of data that would be required for a consolidation, right? Typically, when you're consolidating your UTXOs, you're putting I don't know, like a handful of inputs, right? A handful of your smaller UTXOs as inputs, and then you're creating one larger UTXO as an output. So anyways, this is for single sig, right? And then down here, this is for a multi-sig. So same type of table, right? We have our overhead data and then the amount of data required per input and per output. Okay. So you'll notice that the inputs are a lot more expensive, right? So again, kind of as a reference, it was 68 virtual bytes per input for a single sig, right? For a multi-sig, if you have a 2 of 3, it's 104. So it's maybe about 50% more data that's required per input. If you have a 3 of 5, then it's closer to double the amount of data required. And then a 4 of 7, which it's not, the 4 of 7 is not very common, but you can just see, right? It requires more and more data the larger and larger the UTXO, or sorry, the larger and larger the multisig gets, right? The quorum of keys in the multisig. So I think, just to kind of focus ourselves here, we probably want to compare like a single sig with a 2 of 3 multisig, because that's what most people are dealing with. When we are considering a 10 in and 1 put consolidation, it's going to require about 1,100 virtual bytes of data for a 2 of 3 multisig. For a single sig, right? This native SegWit one, it's 720 virtual bytes. So again, it's about 50% more, right? That's what I was saying, and like you can kind of just give it a ballpark, 50% more. So multisig is going to cost about 50% more to transact with on average when compared to a single sig. So when you're dealing with a multisig, you probably want to shoot for a minimum UTXO size of like 1.5 million sats, maybe even 2 million sats, just to give you a little extra buffer. But yeah, you want to have larger UTXOs with multisigs in general. Long story short, I know we went through a lot of stuff right there, but I don't know. Any questions with this table?
Yeah, I think this is extremely helpful with people. I never saw this table. It was really, really cool to see the table from you. I usually follow your stuff, but this is a really cool table. I love it. The overview also with the multisig, how much is it actually, and like 2 out of 3 and 3 out of 5 for the more common ones. Never saw, I think, 4 out of 7. And the question for me is now then, when we have those high UTXOs, depending on like the system is what it is, but for people that are now not capable of the main layer, it's a little bit off topic now, but what solutions do you see as for transacting on the base layer? Is the solution just layer 2, or just being on some second layer, third layer, or are there any developments for like that getting better? Probably not, because like you need the higher fees to pay the miners, right?
Right. Yeah. So for Bitcoin to succeed, it needs to have high fees. That's just kind of, and you hear about like, you get this FUD of like security budget FUD, right? That's basically people who believe that the users of Bitcoin won't be willing to pay high fees to use it. They believe that eventually fees won't pay miners once the subsidies go to zero, right? Because we all know the subsidy keeps getting cut in half every 4 years, halving is. And eventually you would expect the fees to kind of take over, right? There's a reason why it's called a block reward subsidy, right? It's subsidizing the network while it gets bootstrapped. And then by the time it gets, to full adoption, to full saturation of base layer users, then you would expect the fee market to have matured and to effectively take over in paying the miners in their entirety, right? So, in my opinion, I mean, if fees don't if fees don't mature and actually start paying the miners as the subsidy keeps getting cut in half over and over, then Bitcoin fails. I mean, that's just the truth, right? You need the fees in order to, in order to pay the miners, in order to secure the network. And so I just work off the base assumption that that will happen. I mean, I think that there's no reason to believe it won't. People are going to want to use Bitcoin to secure their value because it's the best store of value we've ever seen, right? It's leak proof, and it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, the more valuable Bitcoin gets, the more users it attracts, the higher net worth users it attracts, the higher fees they're willing to pay, the more hash rate comes online to secure the network, the more valuable Bitcoin becomes, the higher, net worth individuals it attracts to use it to store their value, right? And it just goes over and over and over, like these cycles, until it literally sucks in everybody, right? At least everyone who can afford to use it. And with each cycle, you kind of, like you're sucking in wealthier users, and in doing so, you're also kind of pricing out poorer ones, right? Because Bitcoin as a network is limited in how many transactions it can actually settle. So, for every user that starts using Bitcoin, I mean, at a certain point, right, we haven't reached that full kind of saturation yet. And so we can still have users come in and they're not necessarily like crowding out current users. But at a certain point, you reach a full saturation, and that might be around like 5 to 10 million users, something like that, right? And then at that point, for every new user that wants to come in and use Bitcoin, they have to outbid one of the current users. And that current user, who's like at the kind of the lower end of the wealth spectrum, they get pressed out and they no longer can use the base layer. So I don't know when we're going to reach that full saturation. Probably won't be this cycle. Hopefully not. I hope we have more time than just one more cycle. But, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 cycles, we'll kind of reach this point where we've got, we consistently have maybe like 10 million base layer users who are settling every month on chain, right? They're saving in Bitcoin on exchanges or on other second layers for a month or two, and then they settle that on chain to get it into self-custody and secure it. And if you have 10 million users doing that on a monthly basis, that uses up all the block space and there's none left for anyone else. So, eventually Bitcoin becomes a system for the 10 million top entities who want to settle on chain. And those entities don't necessarily have to be individuals. That could be institutions. They could be second layers themselves who are settling on chain. And, again, they could be like nation states even.
Yeah, and I think the important part to take away from the first section here with the unspendable UTXO is if you have the chance to consolidate Bitcoin at a low fee rate as we have it currently, as we will see it throughout the next periods, you should definitely do it. And I think also with this threshold with 1 million, as we made the examples, I hope I got the numbers now right, but if as we said before, the fees, let's say 100x, which is not unreasonable, then you still have to pay for 1 million sats at 25% fee, which means if you have the chance to consolidate a 10 million Satoshi or maybe even like 20 million Satoshi, this will drop like your percentage of the fee in the future when you have a lot of UTXO you want to spend. Did I get this right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and the idea is like, when you're considering trying to optimize for future high fee environments, it's like you're going to have to pay the fee eventually to move your UTXOs, right? You can't move your Bitcoin without paying the fee, right? So you might as well kind of preemptively do the consolidations of your smaller UTXOs while fees are low, so that you don't have to consolidate them in the future while fees are high. And what you definitely don't want to do, I think, again, like I want to emphasize this because some people, I think, might be a little too scared of kind of how quickly fees might ramp up, and I don't want to I don't want to suggest that it's going to happen, anytime soon and then stay that way. I think we still have a little bit of time left to kind of figure everything out. But when fees are low, right, when they come back down, when they settle down, when these different shitcoin protocols that are using a lot of block space, when they kind of peter out and base layer usage dies down a bit, that's the time to strike, right? Like as a Bitcoin user, if you've got any UTXOs that are kind of small, or you want to, kind of clean up your UTXO set, that's the time that you would want to do it, right? You consolidate at those points. Maybe even if you've got some Bitcoin that's still sitting on exchanges, and even if it's a smaller UTXO, withdraw it and then consolidate it, right? Like you can do that in a 1-2 step. And you can do it like, fairly cheaply if the fees are low. Once the fees get high, though, that's when you kind of want to hunker down and just be like, okay, well, like I've got my self-custody on-chain Bitcoin and cold storage, and that's like my, long-term hodl position. And then I've got, my more recent savings, which maybe you're stacking on an exchange, maybe you're stacking and you're withdrawing it to like a second layer like Liquid, or maybe you're withdrawing it to, maybe you even have like a Lightning channel set up and you're withdrawing it to Lightning, and like you're all set because you have a non-custodial Lightning channel. That'd be awesome. But not everyone's going to have that. But the point is, like, when the fees are high, you kind of like, you have to adapt, and you have to figure out ways to continue stacking Bitcoin, even though you're not necessarily going to be able to always withdraw it on chain right away, right? You might have to like take longer to stack a larger amount before you can take it on chain. What's going to be interesting, though, is when Bitcoin gets extremely valuable and getting up to 1 million sat UTXO becomes like fairly unreachable to the average person, at least, in any reasonable amount of time, right? Like imagine, right now, right, 1 million sat UTXO is close to $600, right? That's how much it costs now. And that's already like, for a lot of people, that's already a decent amount of money to save up. And we're saying, like, don't take that into self-custody until you have that amount saved up minimum, right? Like maybe even more, but like that's the minimum. Now imagine if Bitcoin were to go to $1 million of Bitcoin. Now we're saying, don't take that Bitcoin into self-custody until you have $10,000 worth of Bitcoin saved up minimum. That's a very different playing field and a very different shift in narrative, right? Because we're no longer saying not your keys, not your Bitcoin. We're saying, well, if you don't have $10,000 worth of value, then like you have to pick a custodian, right? Like you have to pick a second layer or a custodian that has different trust trade-offs, and just pray you don't get rugged. And like that becomes a very different environment, and one that I think Bitcoiners will have to grow when we get there, and when we might get there pretty quickly, right? I don't know when we'll get to $1 million of Bitcoin. Maybe this cycle, maybe next, maybe the one after that. Who knows? We'll get there eventually, and when we do, like, we're gonna have to deal with these problems if we don't already have better self-custody scaling solutions, which currently we don't.
I told you a lot about 21 Bitcoin, the best place for me to buy Bitcoin directly on a Bitcoin only exchange. But now let's talk about how to secure your Bitcoin. Once you got Bitcoin, you don't want to leave them on exchange. You want to take self-custody. You want to take responsibility of your own Bitcoin. That's why I recommend getting a BitBox. BitBox is an amazing wallet where you can not only keep your Bitcoin in a simple way, very secure, you can even create a passphrase. With that passphrase, you can basically create a hidden wallet on the device itself. Make sure to buy your BitBox in the link down in the description, and with code Robin, you even get a 5% discount. What would be, I mean, it's a future question, but what would be solutions to that? Like, I feel like education is a big part of it. Even from exchanges education, like not even like podcast education, stuff like that, even from exchanges to say like, okay, if you want to have this in your hardware wallet, just keep in mind UTXO management, or like watch, you can watch this video about UTXO management if you want to withdraw such a small amount. Like there's a lot of different angles and stuff like that we can do. But on top of that, on top of education, what do you think are like scaling solutions for self-custody?
Yeah. Scaling solutions for self-custody. So the problem with scaling self-custody currently is that we have no mechanism to give users self-custody on higher layers without putting data on chain. So self-custody, regardless of which layer you're talking about, whether you're talking about just straight up on-chain self-custody, right, base layer self-custody, or even self-custody on Lightning, both of those require an on-chain footprint, right? Self-custody on Lightning is literally all that means is you own the keys, right, or you own one of the keys that can spend from the UTXO, which is the Lightning channel. So every Lightning channel is a UTXO, by the way. I don't know if, most people don't think of it like that, but every Lightning channel is a UTXO. So if you have non-custodial Lightning, all it means is that you control, part of that UTXO. You're sharing it with your Lightning channel counterparty. You're sharing that UTXO with your counterparty, right? It's like a two-person shared UTXO. And if it's non-custodial on your end, it just means that you have the keys to settle that UTXO and take your sats out of it. So the limitations with scaling currently is, we only are able to do shared UTXOs with two parties, right? Maybe three, like if we really push the limits. Some people have been talking about having 3-party channels in Lightning or in other kind of second layer designs. But the complexity of allowing for that to happen, it gets kind of out of control pretty quickly. So it doesn't scale past 3, right? And 2 is really kind of all we're doing currently is a 2-party shared UTXO. In theory, if we want to scale self-custody, we need to allow for more people to share UTXOs, right? We need to scale that higher so that it's, dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people sharing a single UTXO. And that's really the only way you can scale self-custody is if you allow for that to happen. The only way that I know of to allow for that to happen is with an update called Covenants. And there's a few different proposals for, a couple of different flavors of Covenants, right? I think the most popular of which is CTV, or Check Template Verify. But yeah, it's an update called Covenants, and it basically, in short, allows for you to share UTXOs amongst a lot more people, basically.
Yeah, we had the topic of governments and CCTV not covered on the podcast, but I think at least 5 guests of mine already brought it up and said support that or at least look into it or educate yourself about that. And I think there's the I think the most important message to people is like similar to like buy the dip. If like price of Bitcoin is low, buy it also when the fee rate is low of Bitcoin network. Consolidate your things. Like someone is creative and makes a nice line out of it. There's probably a way to do it with buy the dip and consolidate your Bitcoin UTXOs. But let's get to the next part of it, because we are covering now the part of like unspendable dust of Bitcoin network. But the next part why UTXO management is so important is privacy. So like, how is UTXO management impacting the privacy? And this like consolidating a lot of UTXOs like against the privacy aspect, because you're like saying, okay, this all is my Bitcoin if they were separated before.
Yeah. So the next part of UTXO management is privacy. And actually, I think UTXO management started kind of more focused on privacy, because back in the day, nobody really worried about having dust UTXOs, right? When fees were super low, and when $100 used to be able to buy you 1 million sats or more, right? People just generally were by default withdrawing from exchanges in larger chunks, just because those chunks were cheaper in terms of dollars, right? So the focus originally with Bitcoin was always kind of a privacy focused discussion when it came to UTXO management. And the idea is, because Bitcoin is an open ledger, right? Anybody can download the blockchain and literally see every single transaction that's ever happened since the beginning of Bitcoin. Any transaction that you do will be permanently recorded in the blockchain forever. So the histories of any UTXOs that you spend together will be linked forever, and you can't undo it when you submit that transaction. So if you were to say, let's say that you've been stacking Bitcoin for a number of years, and most of your Bitcoin has just been withdrawals from exchanges, right? You just buy Bitcoin on exchange, you withdraw it every month or whatever, and that's most of your Bitcoin. But then you also have some Bitcoin that you've received maybe as gifts or for doing some work, right? If you're not careful, and if you accidentally, consolidate those UTXOs, or even just spend them together with some of your Bitcoin that came from the exchanges, you link the histories of those UTXOs. And so now all of a sudden, your exchange that you merged those UTXOs with, that exchange knows about your other Bitcoin, right? Which it previously hadn't known about. So like, if you spend some of your Cash App Bitcoin with some of the Bitcoin you got from your friend Bob, then all of a sudden Cash App is like, oh, those are some UTXOs we didn't know belonged to Wicked, but now that he's spending them alongside some of the UTXOs that we sent him and that we've been tracking because the government forces us to track them, now we know that he also has access to this other Bitcoin, right? So we'll put that in our system and send that off to the government whenever they ask for it. So from a privacy perspective, it's very important to like keep your particular stacks of Bitcoin separate, that you don't want their histories to be merged together. So typically, like, you keep your non-KYC Bitcoin in a completely different wallet than your KYC Bitcoin. Maybe you even have like, different wallets for every different non-KYC source of Bitcoin that you get it from. So like, if you're mining, you have like a mining non-KYC wallet. If you're, settling funds from Lightning, maybe you have like a non-KYC Lightning settlement wallet, right? If you're receiving gifts, maybe you have like a non-KYC gift wallet or something like that, right? So like, by keeping these in separate wallets, you kind of ensure that those UTXOs will never get accidentally consolidated together. Okay. The other way that you can do this, which is probably easier from a management perspective because you're not dealing with a bunch of different wallets, is you can just have, one wallet and then label everything. So as long as your software wallet allows you to label your UTXOs, you should definitely get into the habit of labeling them, mostly just with like where they came from. So just keeping track of where each UTXO came from, right? Did this one come from that exchange? Did this one come, from my friend Joe? Did this one come from the change I got back when I paid for my dinner or whatever, right? Just like keep track of those things. And then in that way you can you can kind of like better select the chunks you want to spend in the future. So, like you don't want to spend certain Bitcoin on certain things if you don't want it to be kind of linked in different ways. So that's kind of the overall.
It's like bringing transparency in your own wallet, so you can not bring transparency in the governments and institutional wallets for you to be identified as people. So
that's part of it. And then the other part is like when you're spending Bitcoin, the person you're spending it with, they see the UTXO that you spent, right? Like they can see the sized chunk that you spent. And so if you're buying something that's relatively low cost, but you're using a really big chunk of Bitcoin, purchase it, they're going to see that you just got a bunch of basically if someone's charging, again, going back to the example in the beginning, if someone's charging you 1 million sats for something and you spend a 10 million sat UTXO, they're going to see that you just got 9 million sats back as change, right? As a brand new UTXO. And if that's very, very expensive, right? If that's very valuable, especially if this is like an in-person transaction, there could be some concerns with privacy and security there because, they might be incentivized to rob you at that point. So the other aspect of privacy is being aware of the UTXOs that you're spending in order to kind of spend the right sized chunk. Right, you're not going to whip out like a kilogram gold bar to buy, a gram's worth of gold in it when you're, like if you're spending gold, right? Like think back in the days, right? Spending like a little gram's worth of gold to buy, a bushel of whatever, apples or something. You're not going to like whip out a kilogram gold bar and chop off a little gram of it, because the merchant's going to be like, holy shit, that guy's got a kilogram gold bar. Let's rob him when he goes back to his, his cart or whatever. The same thing.
That's really interesting to think about because, I don't know what has US dollars, $500 notes, or what is the highest on the US dollars? 100?
100, yeah.
Okay, like in euros, there's like a 500 euro note.
Yeah.
And I actually never had one in my hand. I don't know how they look actually. But it's like when you buy like a bag of chewing gum for like €1 and you pay with like a 500 euro thing. It's kind of that example, even though like 500 euros is like maybe not as much as you would like, maybe like you have a full Bitcoin in the future, and it's like a lot worth, and you're buying something small with it, and then the person on the other side sees like, oh shit, there's like 100 million Satoshi UTXO there. So like that's interesting to think about that. With a transaction, you see the full volume of the wallet or the UTXO.
Yeah. You see that. You see the value of UTXO being spent. And so you kind of bring up an interesting point though, because, we're talking about, it's interesting that the largest denomination of euro is 500 euros, right? And the smallest recommended denomination of UTXOs of Bitcoin is currently worth about 600, right? Maybe a little bit, maybe closer to like 500 euro, right? like a 1 million sat UTXO is probably around 500 euro right now, right? So it's almost like, it's like inverted, where it's like the largest denomination in euros is 500 and the smallest denomination in Bitcoin currently is worth about 500. So because of this, it begs a question like, well, how are you going to spend on very small things, right? If all the chunks are supposed to be around 500 euros currently in value, all right, or 1 million sats if you just want to keep denominating in terms of Bitcoin, how are you going to buy things that are worth less than 500 euros? And this is where second layers come in, right? And things that are optimized for like moving smaller amounts. So things like Lightning, and there will be other second layers that emerge over the next decade that will probably be even more optimized, for spending or transacting, right, in smaller amounts, or transacting privately, for example. So, go ahead.
I know I was just like as I imagine it, it would be like you have a bigger chunk in like your self-custody on-chain wallet, and then once a quarter or like once a month or something like that, you take from there to like a Hey wallet. It could be a layer 2 solution. It could be whatever you're paying with like Lightning. And from there, you can then buy your coffee or buy your chewing gum. And then it's like, then people don't see either what you have, and you don't have to spend the transaction fees. Is that what you're going to?
Yeah, exactly. So the way I imagine Bitcoin will work in the future, and again, this will be for the 10 million lucky people who are still able to transact on chain, right? And who still have UTXOs that are large enough to actually spend. What they'll end up doing is semi-regularly they'll kind of top off their checking account, right? So to speak, right? Their spending balances, which will be on second layers. And so you can imagine what this might look like is maybe once every few months, you will lift I think technically like the term might be called lift, right? This is the term that's used by Barak when he talks about his ARC idea for his second layer. But anyways, the idea is like you lift the UTXO up onto the second layer, and then once it's there, once the Bitcoin is there or committed to that second layer, then you can move it around off chain, kind of frictionlessly and a lot cheaper and in smaller amounts, right? And so you'll pay the on-chain fee to get the Bitcoin onto the second layer, but then once it's on the second layer, you can transact in much smaller denominations, and just much more efficiently up there. That's kind of what's already happening. I mean, like, to an extent, that's already what's happening currently, just at a much smaller scale, right? I think Bitcoin as a medium of exchange isn't super widespread in terms of its use, right? We've got these kind of beginning inklings of like an emerging market of Lightning service providers and these custodial wallets, which are all linked together with Lightning. And then you're even starting to like link other layers like Liquid with Lightning, right? Like they're linking Liquid through Lightning to other layers. And so I think eventually what you have in the Bitcoin ecosystem is you have, the base layer, and then on top of that, you have all these other layers, which are probably all going to be linked together with Lightning, right? You can have like Liquid and your exchange have a Lightning channel. You could have Liquid and a Sediment have a Lightning channel. You could have ARC, which is this future idea of a covenants-enabled shared UTXO scheme. You could have ARC and a Sediment linked together with a Lightning channel. So like Lightning will be like kind of like the glue or like the highways that link together all of the custodians as well as all of the second layers and shared UTXOs and whatnot. And then, and then everything is still, linked back to the base layer, because all of these custodians and all of these second layers, like they all still operate under the UTXO model. So at some point, like the Bitcoin that is represented on that layer or the Bitcoin that is being held by those custodians has to be on chain in a UTXO. Right, so that's kind of like how everything links back to the base layer, is through those UTXOs.
For me, it's like now we're coming closer to the end of the podcast, and I want to just quickly like have my 2 key learnings from the podcast, and maybe you can add something if you feel like there's something more, like there's a key learning missing. The one is like consolidate your UTXOs while you still have the chance and while the fees are low, if you can. And this was like the first one, and the second one, it would be like, don't mix your KYC stack with a non-KYC stack, and especially and further, like you can, if you want, don't mix your different non-KYC stacks. If you are able to do also that, is that like the 2 main and key learnings from this video today, or like is there something to add?
Those are the 2 key ones. And the third thing that I would maybe just say, kind of with the last rant I just went on. I know I've been kind of all over the place, so I'm sorry about that. But the third thing I would say is, we're still extremely early when it comes to Bitcoin, right? There's all of these ideas which have yet to be built. They may never actually come to fruition, but a lot of them will, in the next decade, will have a lot of different options when it comes to, different layers or different custodial arrangements or different ways of taking your Bitcoin into self-custody, right? Maybe even directly on second layers eventually. So because we're so early, you have to realize this is a moving target, right? And you have to like really kind of stay involved and pay attention to the changing landscape of what Bitcoin is and how it is used, because we haven't really figured out like exactly how we're going to use this thing in the end. We don't know exactly how we're going to scale it to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. And so while we're figuring this out, it's important for you as an early adopter and as a current, user to keep tabs on all these things. And like, as these new technologies and these new layers emerge, you have to understand whether they are legitimate ways to store your Bitcoin, and ways which, ultimately could save you on fees or make your transactions more private, or, all these other things that you might care about, right? So just to summarize, as an early user, like you have to kind of just, you have to like stay involved. You can't just really okay, if you have a shit ton of Bitcoin, like let's say you just have like a whole Bitcoin or even more, right? You can just sit on that UTXO and you'll be fine. You could come back in a decade or two, and whatever the landscape is at that point, you can assess and you can say, okay, that looks like the best second layer. I'm going to lift some Bitcoin up onto there and then I'll be able to spend on that. That's fine. But for most people who are coming in now, who aren't coming in with like whole Bitcoins, or they're just stacking smaller amounts and they're trying to like save up as much as possible, they might only have a few million sats. And if you're in that position, you have to pay close attention, because you're going to be affected a lot more. You're going to be much more fee sensitive than those larger participants. And so you have to be nimble and able to move your, relatively smaller amount of Bitcoin up onto second layers, like when the time is right. Okay. And some people are already kind of doing that, right? Like some people are just stacking on Liquid, right? Or some people are just like stacking directly into a Lightning channel. Or some people are just leaving their Bitcoin on an exchange because they don't want to deal with all of this, right? And honestly, that's fine too. Like, it's not for everybody. It's not highly recommended, but like, I understand, like, like we're getting to the point now where there's just so many people who are starting to get involved in Bitcoin that there's going to be a large array of the types of ways in which people interface with Bitcoin. So yeah, just, stay involved. If you want to be a sovereign Bitcoin user, you have to keep paying attention. You have to keep learning. And, all those other things that you said earlier about UTXO management. So
that's why everybody should follow Wicked on Twitter and YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I try to put out good content, but there's definitely a lot of other people who are very good follows as well. So, follow an array of Bitcoiners so you get a full spectrum of knowledge and, and I don't know, just mess around with Bitcoin, like use it, right? Like actually use it. And then you'll get a sense of how it works. And you'll become a better, more well-equipped Bitcoin user if you actually use it.
That's why I kind of started all the podcast, because I wanted to have some video format of my Twitter. And I was like, I don't have enough information in my brain to talk every day about Bitcoin and a different topic. So why don't I just invite people that are way smarter than me, and I learn from them, and let my audience also learn from them. So like I invite just people that are smart and have specific knowledge, and try to do every day a Bitcoin conversation with someone in the Bitcoin sphere, which is extremely cool for me to being able to do that. And second, to just learn from those people. It's fascinating to see, and that's why I encourage everybody to follow Wicked, and as I encourage everybody to follow the people that are on my podcast video, because almost all of them I want to have a second time or third time or fourth time on, and they are definitely worth following, or even just follow them. Yeah. Before we get to the end routine, I have one small question for you, if you still have a little bit of time. Why did you choose to be anonymous? Why did you choose to stay Wicked and not who you really are?
It's a good question. So, I mean, I just, the way I see Bitcoin evolving in the future is, I believe it's going to be an extremely valuable money in the future. Like, kind of, we all joke about Bitcoin being worth like $1 million or even more dollars in today's dollars, right? And I think at a certain point it becomes so valuable that you could easily become targeted if your name's out there, and if you're associated with having been an early adopter of Bitcoin. It's not like it's not a sure thing, right? I mean, you can always have like good security practices in real life, and so you can, I mean, there's plenty of early adopters who their names are out there and they haven't been robbed yet, and they have hundreds or thousands of Bitcoin. So I'm sure it's possible to stay safe, but I think it's just, I don't want to have to deal with that if I don't have to. So I prefer to stay anonymous. I also just, I don't want to mix my personal life with Bitcoin. Like I don't want my job knowing that I'm involved in Bitcoin very much. I'd rather just kind of keep the two separate, at least for now. Who knows what happens in the future. But at least for now, I think staying anonymous is probably the best bet for me, at least.
I think it's also a really noble thing to do if you think about it, because you are contributing to the Bitcoin community, you are educating people and you don't really take credit for it. Like, of course, there is some account that you are owning and people like kind of associate that, and you could switch on with like a face and stuff like that. But at least to this day, you are not taking personal credit for the education that you are doing. So like, I always respect everybody that is pseudonym or like anonymous on the podcast. I think I had like 5-6 people already on that didn't show their face and were completely anonymous here. So I highly respect that, and I love. I usually like enjoy the conversation with those people a lot, as today. We're having an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest is. So these kind of questions are usually completely different than the rest of the podcast. And your question is, if you were the host of an interesting one, if you were the host of a political debate between the US presidential candidates, what question would you ask?
What question would I? Oh man, it's interesting. Who was the last guest? No. Okay, so yeah, I don't really do politics very much, so I don't have a good sense of like what a good question would be to ask. To be honest, I mean, I'm obviously very focused on Bitcoin, so I would probably ask them something about Bitcoin. Maybe I'd ask them what they think about Bitcoin, just straight up. I'd want to know kind of where their head was at in terms of Bitcoin. So I know that's kind of that's a lame answer.
I would answer the same thing. I would just want to know what they think of Bitcoin. Honestly, if in any, like, because I was really involved in politics, but now I'm not. Like, the more I got involved in Bitcoin, the more I got distanced from politics. It's funny how it goes. And for me, it's like I would love for Bitcoin to be a topic somewhere around those elections that we all have. Like, Austria has election, European Union has an election, America has an election this year. So like, I would love for Bitcoin to be a topic, but if not, I don't care also. So it will be interesting to watch. For the end, where can people find it the best? I mean, we already followed it a little bit before. You are on Twitter with Wicked. You are on YouTube. I think I also saw some videos from you, and I will drop your details in below. But if people want to ask you questions, if people want to reach out to you, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, definitely on Twitter. So my handle on Twitter is W_S_Bitcoin. And my username is just Wicked. And then on YouTube, my username is Wicked Smart Bitcoin. So that's where the W and the S come from my Twitter username, by the way. Right, Wicked Smart, and then Bitcoin. Yeah, if you want to reach out on Twitter, I'm always available. You can either send me a DM or just tag me on something and ask questions. Always happy to help you find the answers to any of your Bitcoin related questions. I try to hop on Twitter Spaces fairly frequently, so that's also a great place to ask questions in a more kind of live setting, right? I think for me in particular, like, Twitter Spaces is what ramped up my understanding of Bitcoin from 0 to 100 in a matter of months. So if you find kind of like there's a few Twitter Spaces which are pretty high signal, right, where like they're primarily Bitcoin focused and they don't really get off the beaten path too much. But yeah, if you find those Twitter Spaces and you go up on stage, ask questions, a lot of the times, man, Bitcoiners are always more than happy to help get you answers or to help answer your questions. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Find me on Twitter.
Perfect. Then thank you for your time, Wicked.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Robin.